Hey guys, it's a little after 9. Um, Coming on with part 2 of what I tried to do in one part earlier today. Had connection issues. If you tuned into that, I got about 35 minutes into it, and my connection just completely severed, so I wasn't able to complete the stream. It was glitchy for a while, and then it just finally kicked me off. So I'm coming back now. Hopefully my connection is more stable. The wind has died down. Although I did lose connection a few minutes ago, so hopefully that's not a harbinger of things to come this evening. Um, so it worked out okay because the way the connection loss timed out, it was just as I had kind of laid out the problem, if you will, the whole circumcision thing, the problem with it, the debate. And, because you do have two camps, some people believe absolutely, yes, your males must be circumcised. Some people believe no, it's an anathema to be circumcised, okay? And there are scriptural things that can back up both points, but how do we reconcile that? We can't have the Bible saying two completely different things, especially when it's in basically the same context, okay? So that's what I want to hope to reconcile tonight. I want to hope to kind of look at those two things together because we end up with this paradox. Because as I mentioned, and I'll summarize a little bit what I went over earlier today before we go further. I do suggest that if you're tuning in now and you did not listen to the one from earlier today, part 1 of this, that you please go back and listen to that first. Just dump out of this for now and come back later because I'm not going to reinvent the wheel and go through everything I discussed there. So it is beneficial, I think, if you go back and listen to that first before proceeding to part 2. But again, I'm not the government, so I can't make you do anything. Okay. Um, okay. So to kind of summarize the dilemma here, okay, to kind of summarize everything I've discussed so far, we have in the Old Testament, point blank, it specifically says that there's a covenant made with Abraham and his descendants to circumcise the males on the 8th day after their birth. We have that echoed again in Leviticus chapter 12 when we have a Torah commandment that the males are to be circumcised on the 8th day. We have in Exodus chapter 12 a commandment for if you're going to partake of the Passover, your males must all be circumcised. Okay, so it's a key thing in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament, even in the Torah, that your males need to be circumcised. We get into the New Testament. We have Paul writing the letter to the Galatians where he comes out very forcefully and says, look, if you're circumcised, you're missing out on Messiah. You're out of the loop here. Okay? And basically makes it sound like if you decide to get circumcised, you're done. You're out of the Messiah equation, okay? You're out of grace. So where it kind of comes to a head for me is where we see that Paul, the same guy who said that, has Timothy circumcised, but he does not have Titus circumcised. Why? So that's what I'm going to try to resolve in part 2 of this, at the conclusion of this study. I am going to kind of read some of the stuff I read earlier just to kind of set this up for anyone who's tuning in for the first time and just kind of springboard into where I'm going, okay? In Acts chapter 15, we have the whole problem, the whole reason the Council of Jerusalem was convened was because you had Pharisee believers, Pharisees who had converted over to belief that Yahshua or Jesus was a Messiah. They were going around saying, hey, if you want to be saved, you've got to be circumcised. Okay? And so you've got these new Gentile believers who were like, wait a minute, I don't understand. They question it. And of course, Paul, who had been speaking and given the gospel to the Gentiles, took issue with that. So they have this council. And, basically the conclusion of it was, we're just going to have the Gentiles do these 4 things, these 4 basic things, abstain from sacrificed food to idols, from eating blood, from eating things that were strangled, and from fornication, okay? And it doesn't usually get interpreted this way, but if you interpret the text logically, they're basically saying, do these 4 basic things, and then you can come into the synagogues later, and you can hear the law of Moses. You can hear the Torah. The implication is that You hear the commandments, you hear the laws of Moses, which are actually the laws of Yahweh, passed down through Moses, and then you kind of know what to do at that point, circumcision being one of those. But to say right off the bat that you've got to get circumcised right away, or you don't have salvation, is not scriptural. It's just not. And that was what they were trying to clarify there. And the point that I tried to make in the first part of this is this council was at least a decade, and there are different chronologies on when this took place, but it was bare minimum a decade after the cross. So if this was just a button-down thing, the cross, the law was completely done away with. The Torah, the commandments given at Sinai was completely done and over with. Why are we having this discussion in Acts 15? Why is this an issue? Why couldn't they have just said, guys, it's clear. There is no more commandment to do that, so don't even bother with it. But instead, the debate is not should people be circumcised in general. The debate is, should Gentile believers be circumcised? That was the debate. And we notice, and I pointed this out earlier, that at the conclusion, they never say Gentiles should not be circumcised. They don't make that conclusion. They basically say, do these 4 things, then you can come into synagogue and learn the commandments and go from there. But they do not say, if you are a Gentile, you don't have to be circumcised. Which makes sense because we get into Acts 16 and we see Paul circumcising Timothy. Now we know that Timothy, his dad was Greek and his mother was Jewish. And we know from later on, we find out later that Timothy was actually raised to where he was basically taught the Bible, which at that point was the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, the writings, okay? So Timothy, being raised by his Jewish mother, was taught the commandments growing up, presumably. He knew the Bible. So by the time he was an adult, it wasn't like he all of a sudden had to learn it. Okay? And so the question is in Acts 15, if they had decided Gentiles didn't have to be circumcised, why Paul circumcised Timothy? Now, I've seen the argument made, it's because his dad was a Gentile and his mother was Jewish, okay? So because his mother was Jewish, that means he is a Jew, and therefore he is obligated to be circumcised because Jews are supposed to be circumcised because they're supposed to keep the law, okay? And the argument goes that because of his dad being Greek, most likely he was not permitted to be circumcised as a child when he should have. And so as an adult, now that he's hanging around with Paul and company, now Paul is like, okay, you're Jewish, you're going to be in the company of other Jews who know you're Jewish, you really ought to get circumcised. Let's do this, okay? You're out from under your Greek dad now, let's go ahead and do this, okay? But the problem is, with that logic, there's nothing in the Bible that says that your lineage is traced through your mother. That's a relatively recent innovation. We know that if you're going to actually move permanently to Israel, you have to prove that your mother is Jewish in some way, not your father, okay? Now, again, there's nothing in the scripture that says that, because when they give the lineage, it's so-and-so, son of so-and-so, so-and-so, son of so-and-so. And when they trace those genealogies, it's always through the male. It's not through the female. You do have a female thrown in there occasionally, like you have Ruth thrown in there with the lineage of Yahshua or Jesus, but generally the lineage is traced down through the male. So the idea that the reason Paul had Timothy circumcised was because his mother was Jewish, and therefore Timothy was Jewish, and because he's Jewish, he's under the law and he has to be circumcised, doesn't hold any water when you look at it in context with the rest of the scripture. Okay? So if we're going to be consistent with the pattern established in scripture, we could consider Timothy more of a Gentile, more of a Greek than we would a Jew, because his father was Greek. Okay? And that gets into the next part of this. When we go into the book of Galatians, we see in chapter 2 that when Paul went to Jerusalem for the council, he took Titus along with him. Titus, it says, was Greek. There's no mention of having a Jewish mother or anything. It just says he was Greek. So presumably his mother and father were both Greek, okay, Gentiles. Now the assumption is from some that this is why Paul refused to have him circumcised, because he is full-blooded Greek. He's full-blooded Gentile. So because of that, he doesn't have to be circumcised like the Jews do, okay? And then, when I say that, it harkens back to all the language that we read earlier about, basically the implication that if you're Jews, you're circumcised, and if you're Gentile, you are uncircumcised. So you have whole groups of people identified by that one marker, the circumcision and the uncircumcision. Okay, you have a whole people group, and the closest thing I can think of now is people identify by skin color, and I'm sure they always have. You have black people, white people, Asians, Hispanics, everything, and it's an easy way to identify people, So in Jewish culture, it would have been an easy way to identify people who were in covenant and who were not. Okay, so just kind of a refresher of kind of where we left off on part one there, and it kind of just begs the question, well, to me, there's no consistency with the circumcision of Timothy versus the circumcision of Titus. Okay, so this is where I'm going to kind of apply what I think is a potential resolution to that, and I want to reiterate that basically I'm just giving my opinion here. Okay, this is what I've come to believe based on my studies, and I'm throwing it out there for consideration. I'm not saying that you have to abide by anything I'm going to say here, and if you're an adult male, you'll be maybe glad that I'm not fully telling you to do anything. Of course, you don't have to anyway, right? So anyway, okay. So why am I getting back into Galatians here? Let's actually go there. I mentioned I was going to earlier, but then I ended up starting in Acts. So let's go to Galatians. I'll get there eventually. Okay. Now I'm going to read in verse. I'm going to start in verse 3. Okay. Now, in the first part of this, like I said earlier, I went over. We started off in the book of Genesis when Yahweh gave the covenant of circumcision to Abraham. Okay, he told him to circumcise himself. He told him to circumcise his sons on the 8th day, his descendants, including anybody that he owned, his servants. And we know later that he ends up actually circumcising himself. He ends up circumcising Ishmael when he was 13 years old, and of course when Isaac is born, he's circumcised on the 8th day. And we know that Yahweh says that the circumcision is a sign of the covenant. Okay, which covenant? The land covenant that he had just made with Abraham, saying that your descendants will inherit this land as an everlasting possession. Everlasting meaning forever, presumably. Okay, so the circumcision is a sign of that. Now that begs the question: anybody can be circumcised. Any male on the planet can be circumcised. Okay, we have I mentioned Ishmael. Okay. His offspring, his descendants, ended up being generally now in modern times the Arabs and other groups, basically Islamic folks, and they practice male circumcision just like Jews do, just like a lot of Christians do. Okay, so are we going to say that because they are circumcised, they are part of this covenant with Abraham? Obviously not. Okay, now, and I think that if you're thinking, you're kind of starting to maybe predict where I'm going to go with this. Okay, so I'm going to read Galatians chapter 3. I'm going to start in verse 6. Even so, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. Okay, so it's those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. The scripture, foreseeing that God, Yahweh, would justify the Gentiles, the nations, by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the nations will be blessed in you. So then those who are of faith are blessed with Abraham the believer. Now right here, he point blank says he defines the gospel. This is Paul, defines the gospel as what Yahweh told Abraham, all the nations will be blessed in you. By Paul's own words here, that is the gospel. Now, if you watched the stream I did a few days ago on the gospel, the general point that I made is that the plan has always been, the gospel has always been, that all the nations would be blessed in Abraham. And it all connects back to this land covenant because it is perpetual, it is everlasting. And Yahshua's life, death, and resurrection are the mechanism that brings all that about, that brings the nations back to Abraham, back to that faith, because he is the father of our faith, okay? So if you're not tracking with me on that, maybe when this is over, see if you can check that out. I forget which day I posted it, but it's on my feed somewhere, on my wall. Okay, so the sons of Abraham are by faith. This is why when John the Baptist is preaching down by the river and the Pharisees come, he tells them, Yahweh can raise up sons of Abraham from the stones. Okay? Because by that point, your typical Jewish leadership, your Pharisees or Sadducees, the ones who were very much into the system, okay, they were walking by the letter of the law and not by the spirit of the law. Let's check all the boxes and do all the stuff and we're good. One of those boxes is circumcision. Okay? And by that point, they had it in their minds, we're circumcised. So based on the covenant that Yahweh made with Abraham that we read earlier back in Genesis, then we're good. All right? We're good. And so that's how they were able to justify fudging the Torah. And we see that they did certain things where they kind of messed with it and they distorted it. They basically manipulated it to meet their means, okay, their ends. And so they were comfortable with that because they were circumcised. Okay? So like I said earlier, any man on the planet can be circumcised. But does that by itself mean that he is in covenant with Yahweh? Absolutely not. And so I think that this is why Paul was talking about in Galatians chapter 5, okay, when he talked about, I testify again to you, this is in 5 verse 3, that I testify again to every man who receives circumcision that he is under obligation to keep the whole law. You have been severed from Christ, you who are seeking to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. Okay? So by his own words there, if we apply that just in a box, in isolation, the moment he had Timothy circumcised, Timothy was severed from Christ, he's obligated to keep the whole law, okay? And he's just in bad shape. He's fallen from grace. Well, that can't be true. It can't be true, right? Timothy, we know this doesn't apply to Timothy, but yet he was circumcised as an adult man by Paul. Okay? So how do we reconcile that? And I think the way that we reconcile that is let's do a quick little mini Bible study in this, and we'll kind of set this up, okay? Let's go to Genesis. If you studied the Bible seriously for any length of time, there is a concept called the law of first mention. I don't know, I'm pretty sure they teach this in the seminaries. I know that they teach it in the yeshivas, the Jews and stuff, because it's an established concept. And generally, if you want to know what a word means, because in Hebrew, a word can have many meanings, and the meaning is derived by the context. So like an example, if you take in Hebrew the three letters MLK, okay? So basically, Mem, Lamed, I think it's Kuf. Okay, so MLK basically would be the transliteration in English. Now, I don't mean Martin Luther King. What I mean is, if you take those three letters, original Hebrew had no vowels. That's a modern innovation with the Masoretes in the medieval times. At the time the Bible was written, and even in Second Temple times, there were no vowels. You only had those three consonants. Some of them did function as vowels, but generally they were consonants. The way that you knew what that word meant was by the context. So like MLK can mean Malik, which is king. It can mean Melech, which is messenger, which gets translated also as angels because they bring messages from God. But it can also be translated as Molech, this pagan idol in Moab that they sacrificed their newborn infants to. Those same three letters can have three radically different meanings based on the context. But you don't know that unless you know what the context is. Okay, so that's where the law of first mention comes in. When you go back and you look at the first time a word is introduced, or sometimes even phrases are introduced in the Bible, more often than not, that sets the tone on how you're going to interpret that word throughout the scriptures. Now, where the word like MLK, it doesn't really hold a ton of weight because, like I said, that has three radically different meanings. Just because it means one thing the first time doesn't mean it's going to be consistent all the way through. So you can't apply this across the board, but it is a general rule, okay? So with that in mind, when we go to Genesis chapter 9, and we see we have just had the flood. They've exited the ark. Noah builds his altar. And then I'll start reading in verse 8. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, Now behold, I myself do establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you. Now, that's the same exact language that he used when he set up his covenant with Abraham. He's establishing his covenant with Abraham and his descendants after him. Okay? So keep that in mind. And with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, every beast of the earth with you, of all that comes out of the ark, even every beast of the earth, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood, neither shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. Okay? And then he goes to and he makes the rainbow as a sign of the covenant. But I want to focus in on a couple things here. A, he's talking about covenant. B, he's talking about in verse 11, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be cut off by the water of the flood. I don't want to get too graphic there, but that language is kind of like circumcision language. When you're circumcised, you have flesh cut off. Okay? So this is the first time this phrase cut off appears in the Bible. And it's in relation to a covenant. It's relation to there's a covenant established, and the reason why all the flesh was cut off to begin with was because they weren't obeying Yahweh. The earth was corrupt and wicked to its core, and it was only Noah that was found righteous. Okay, so it all ties back to covenant. It all ties back to covenant. Since we're in Genesis, I will go ahead and just read the language real quick about circumcision. This is Genesis chapter 17. I'll read in verse 9. God said further to Abraham, Now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. Same language as he just used with Noah. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your descendants after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Okay? Every male among you who is 8 days old shall be circumcised throughout your generations. A servant who is born in the house or who is bought with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. A servant who is born in your house or who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. Okay, he's used that word everlasting here again. But an uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that person shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Okay? So, essentially, what we're looking at here, okay, when Yahweh made his covenant with Abraham initially, when they had the animals, they cut them in two, they cut the pieces, they split them in two, they made a path in the middle, okay? And Yahweh himself walked through those pieces. He walked between them. The whole fiery furnace, okay? Went through them, and that's how he made the covenant with Abraham. Abraham was in a trance. Abraham was asleep. He had nothing to do with it. He was just there, okay? So it was basically a way of saying Yahweh was making an unconditional covenant with Abraham to give him that land forever, okay? Now, the key takeaway there is that covenant, and we don't process this in modern times because this is not how we make covenants now. But in that time, when you made a covenant like this, what you were basically saying was, whatever I just did to these animals or whatever is going to happen to the person who breaks this covenant. Okay? So, in other words, with the cutting of the pieces, Yahweh was basically saying that that covenant was an established covenant between people. It was used for business transactions, all kinds of stuff. Whoever walked through those pieces, if they broke the covenant, they would be basically split in two and killed just like those animals. Okay, so you were basically saying, I will not break this covenant under penalty of death. It's basically what you were saying when you made that covenant. All right, so of course Yahweh cannot die, so him walking through those pieces by himself was a way of saying, this will happen. Don't doubt it. There's no possibility of this covenant failing because he's eternal. He can't die. He's basically proving to him in language that he can understand, covenant language, that he's not going to break that covenant. Okay? So with circumcision, if we apply that same type of logic, what we're basically seeing here is circumcision. You have a piece of flesh that's having some cut off of it, okay? He's basically saying the flesh is representative of the people as a whole because he's making a covenant with a people, Abraham and his descendants. Whoever doesn't keep the covenant will be cut off from those people the same way the foreskin was removed from that piece of flesh, without getting too graphic. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, this is not the most kid-friendly study, but it is what it is. Okay, so this is what he did with Abraham. Now, I want to go back to the New Testament and what we talked about with Paul, okay, in Galatians. He talked about the sons of Abraham being of faith. So the descendants of Abraham are by faith. Now, we know that Abraham, when he was first called by Yahweh, he was not circumcised. Yahweh made the covenant with him first, and then he introduced the circumcision element to it. This is why, in Acts 15, it was not reasonable to expect new believers to be circumcised right away coming into it. Abraham wasn't even circumcised right away. Faith comes first, okay? And then with Abraham, the circumcision came later, okay? So to go back to Timothy and Titus, Timothy already knew the law. He was raised, he was taught the commandments growing up. It wasn't anything new to him. He didn't necessarily have to go into the synagogues and learn the law of Moses like a Gentile believer who had never been exposed to that would. It was new to him. The only thing that he needed to do at that point as an adult male out from under his father's covering was to go ahead and be circumcised because it was a commandment. Okay? Now, Titus, on the other hand, with Titus, we don't know all of his background. We don't know how long he had been a believer. We don't know. We're assuming he was never raised. We're assuming he was never taught the commandments or anything, being full Greek. It would have been very unusual for a Greek to actually attend synagogue every Sabbath. So he may have had almost no background, if at all any, in understanding this. So think about a group of Jews who were circumcised on the 8th day when they were born. They have no memory of it. They're going to expect a grown man who is coming into this by faith to just immediately get circumcised. Like, can you imagine? Like, oh, that's great for you, and it's like we're going to expect you to go through all this agony and circumcise yourself as an adult when we were circumcised as babies at 8 days old, and we can't even remember what it was like. We have no concept of the pain that we're expecting you to go through now. So I think that's, and this is my interpretation, I think that is part of the reason why Paul was resistant to having Titus circumcised, as he talked about in Galatians, okay? Because anybody can be circumcised. To just demand that a grown man be circumcised to gain entry into the club, so to speak, to get in the door, is not reasonable, okay? And so with that, I'm going to segue into, I want to go back to, let's see here. I had all this kind of like organized and planned out before I was cut off in the first go around. So I'm kind of trying to kind of loop around and kind of finish it up as I had planned now that I'm doing a part two, so this is not going to be as smooth as I had hoped, but I'm hoping that by the time I'm done, I will still have the point made. Actually, instead of going to Galatians, I want to go to Romans. I want to go to Romans 11, okay? And this is going to kind of begin to formulate my hypothesis on circumcision and why it's relevant today, because I am going to make the case that believers should be circumcised, okay? But I'm not just going to tell you, just as my opinion or whatever. I'm going to try to give you actual scriptural evidence of that, okay? Now I'm going to read Romans 11, and I don't know that I'll go through the whole thing, but I'll go through probably most of it, okay? And I want you to keep in mind as I read this, the language that we were using earlier, about that cut off language, okay? And I didn't get into it here, but when you go back and you read the commandments, you read like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, a lot of those commandments talk about when a person breaks that commandment, they will be cut off from their people. Same language used in the circumcision commandment with Abraham, and it's similar to what we read about with Noah, about flesh, flesh being cut off, okay? So I want to just kind of keep that in your mind as we read this, and we're going to see if we can kind of figure out what's going on here. I say then, God has not rejected his people, has he? May it never be, for I too am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So Paul is a flesh and blood Israelite, okay? He's not some Gentile out there with not a drop of Israelite DNA. He is a flesh and blood Israelite. He would have been circumcised on the 8th day. That would have just been a given, okay? God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. Or do you not know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he pleads with God against Israel? Yahweh, they have killed your prophets. They have torn down your altars, and I alone am left, and they are seeking my life. But what is the divine response to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. In the same way, then, there has also come to be at the present time a remnant according to Yahweh's gracious choice. But if it is by grace, it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace is no longer grace. What then? What Israel is seeking, it has not obtained. But those who were chosen obtained it, and the rest were hardened, just as it is written. Yahweh gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes to see not, and ears to hear not, down to this very day. And David says, let their table become a snare and a trap, and a stumbling block, and a retribution to them. Let their eyes be darkened to see not, and bend their backs forever. I say then, they did not stumble so as to fall, did they? May it never be. But by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Gentiles just means nations. Keep that in mind as well. Now, if their transgression is riches for the world, and their failure is riches for the Gentiles, the nations, how much more will their fulfillment be? But I'm speaking to you who are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of the Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen, and save some of them. For if their rejection is the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? If so, if the first piece of dough is holy, the lump is also holy, and if the root is holy, the branches are too. So let's focus in on this. We're going to read further, and this is going to hopefully solidify where I'm going with this. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them and became partaker with them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. You will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right, they were broken off for their unbelief. Okay, now who are the descendants of Abraham? Those who believe. Those who are of faith are of his sons. Okay, so they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Now, I'm thinking at this point we can connect this kind of back to Abraham. Let's see if this bears out as we continue. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if Elohim Yahweh did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. Behold then the kindness and severity of God. To those who fell, severity, but to you Yahweh's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you also will be cut off. And they also, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and were grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will those who are the natural branches be grafted into their own olive tree? So what I'm thinking is, if we track this all back to Abraham, the father of our faith, because we know that those who are of faith are the sons of Abraham, as Paul mentioned in Galatians. If we take this back to Abraham, that covenant made with him included circumcision. And we were told that those who were not circumcised would be cut off. Okay? So if we apply this language here of this tree and the cutting off, the grafting in, I'm proposing that the natural branches are those whose parents made the choice to have them circumcised on the 8th day. Okay? They were basically, from the beginning of their lives, they had the sign of the covenant in their flesh. Now, as I stated earlier, that only gets you so far, because at the end of the day, it's your conduct that determines how you end up. It's your faith that determines how you end up. And as Paul just said here, unbelief, lack of faith, gets you cut off from that tree. And if we go back and we look at the commandments, why would you keep Yahweh's commandments if you don't have faith in him? Why would you keep his commandments voluntarily if you don't believe in him? So by choosing to not obey Yahweh's commandments, and in those cases I mentioned earlier, I didn't read them, but they're there. You can go and look. All those cases where it says, if you break this commandment, if you do this, if you don't do that, you'll be cut off from your people. You're only going to do that if you have a lack of faith and a lack of belief. If you have faith in Yahweh and his promises and his sovereignty, you're going to work to obey his commandments. You just are. Okay? So I think that those people who were circumcised on the 8th day by their parents are the natural branches. Now, when they become adults, if they experience unbelief, if they lose their faith, and they begin to walk contrary to Yahweh, they will be cut off. They will be removed from the tree. A Gentile who was not circumcised on the 8th day, because the Gentiles, your Greeks and stuff, were not doing that. They had no reason to. Now, you come in by faith. So you were not circumcised on the 8th day as a child, but you're able to be grafted in because of your faith. Okay, you're able to be put in. You have faith, so you are a son of Abraham. This tracks back to Abraham. Okay, so you can be put in, but however, we know that those covenants that Yahweh made with Abraham were eternal. They're everlasting. The covenant of circumcision is everlasting. Yahweh's own words, not James's. Okay? So I think at some point, if you do decide to graft into Israel, Abraham's people, Abraham's descendants, by faith, at some point you will eventually, if you're an adult, make that decision to get circumcised. Now, in Titus's case, we don't know if he ever got circumcised. All we know is that when he went to Jerusalem with Paul, Paul resisted pressure to have him circumcised right there. Maybe he wasn't ready. It's a big step. Adult circumcision is a major deal. It's not something that you just walk into lightly. Okay? Maybe he wasn't ready. Maybe he had some fear. We don't know. We don't know. For all we know, when they got back to Antioch or wherever, and he was kind of more comfortable, and maybe he had time to pray about it and dig in and study more, maybe he was circumcised later. We don't know from the text. It's unclear. But the assumption is that because he was a Gentile, he wasn't required to be circumcised. I'm saying that even though you're a Gentile, if you're going to be grafted into that root of Abraham, and into the covenants of promise, at some point in your life, if you haven't already been circumcised, you should. Now, I do think that it is, because it is a fleshly sign, even though I do think it should be done, I think there are weightier issues because, like I said, you as a 30-year-old man, you can decide to be circumcised, and then you can fall off the wagon when you're 40. Your circumcision is useless at that point. And I think that's why Paul says in Galatians that circumcision is nothing, uncircumcision is nothing in Christ. Because when we choose to walk in faith and follow the Messiah and follow the ways of the kingdom, yes, we might have that marking in our flesh, but it's not the only thing that's going to get us in the kingdom. It's not the only thing that's going to get us salvation. It's a piece of the puzzle. I think it's an important piece of the puzzle, but I think that the Jews of Yahshua's time, the Jews of Jesus's time, had basically simplified it to the point to where that was the main piece of the puzzle. You're circumcised. The rest of it is ancillary. The rest of it is just icing on the cake, And so I think that that's why they were able to twist and manipulate the Torah the way they did, was because they had more confidence in the cutting of their flesh than they did the faith and walking in faith and obedience, the spirit of the law. Okay, like Yahshua told us. Okay, so I think that that's the way you reconcile it. I really do, because on the one hand, yes, you can have the circumcision, but you can fall out of faith. Your circumcision is useless at that point. Okay, but at the same time, like Titus, even though he wasn't circumcised at the time he went to Jerusalem with Paul, are you going to tell me that he wasn't justified? Are you going to tell me that Titus at that point was faithless and was walking contrary to God? You'd have a hard time convincing me of that. Why would Paul bring him along if Paul saw that? So Paul obviously saw the faith in Titus. He obviously saw him as a fellow son of Abraham by faith, or else he wouldn't have brought him along as a companion, if that makes sense. So yes, I do think that based on the language of the covenant, based on how we as believers of faith are descendants of Abraham, the covenant terms made with Abraham do apply to us. I really do believe that. And it's important too, because we see with some of these other things. This is part one of a three-part. Technically, I guess it's part 1.5. I'm planning to do basically a three-part series, getting into detail about the three signs, the three covenant signs of Yahweh's people: circumcision, weekly Sabbath, and Passover. And so, this is one that's required for Passover. You have to, if you're going to eat the Passover, it says you're supposed to be circumcised. And I realize that's controversial in modern times. You're not going to, it's kind of awkward to check everybody at the door. I don't think I would personally. I would just take you at your word for it, but it is a requirement. So I think that that's personally James's opinion after a lot of study, after a lot of just trying to just think logically about it. That makes the most sense. The circumcision has to do with whether you are a natural branch or not. That's that at its core. That's what it is. It defines you as a natural branch, but those natural branches can still be cut off. They can still be cut off. You're not guaranteed a golden ticket. You're not guaranteed salvation just because you are circumcised in the flesh. And I haven't even gotten into the language of circumcision of the heart. That's a whole other thing. It's connected. But I think that's where those who are grafted in by faith, I think that it is relevant to the circumcision of the heart. And I won't get into that here because I'll be going another hour plus. The circumcision of the heart is relatively easy to understand as you go through and read those passages. It's not as cryptic as some of the stuff, I don't think. But anyway, I think I'm going to leave it at that. Circumcision is, if you're circumcised on the 8th day, and I think that this is why, the covenant went through Isaac. Isaac was circumcised on the 8th day, like Yahweh commanded Abraham. Ishmael was circumcised when he was 13. So yes, even though Ishmael was circumcised, the covenant did not go through him. Okay, so there's another witness to this whole thing. It tracks back to that covenant with Abraham. And if we're going to be part of the covenants of promise, like I didn't read it, but Paul talks about it in Galatians. If you've been listening to me talk for any length of time or know me any number of years, you don't hear me talk much about Galatians. But it seems like I've been in it all day today. He talks about how where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought in Galatians. But anyway, um, it all the covenants of promise, the covenants of promise. Okay, those covenants of promise. That's the promise with Abraham. That's the covenant with the unconditional covenant with Abraham, and it is a land covenant, and it is everlasting, and the sign of that covenant is circumcision. Okay, so I know that if you are watching this, there's a really good chance that you have the typical belief that okay, my phone is telling me things. Um, you have the belief that the ultimate goal of this is that we die and we go to heaven forever. Everything in the Bible, everything when you read through the prophets, just what we read here, everlasting covenant with Abraham, that his descendants would possess that land forever. Okay, so the idea that we die and we go to heaven just forever is antithetical to what the Bible sets up. Even the New Jerusalem in Revelation comes down to earth. Okay, it's the earth is the focus, and people will look at that and they'll say, well, when you say that, you're focusing on the flesh. Okay, I'm not the one saying it. The Bible's the one saying it. All the prophets pretty much talk about everything in the kingdom, or the eternal, however you want to look at it, being on earth. And I think that that's how we reconcile his covenant with Abraham, that it would be an everlasting possession to his descendants. And we know his descendants are by faith, not by flesh. I think you can be both. You can be a natural branch, and you can stay on that tree by your faith. But the moment you step out of that faith, you're cut off. So I feel like I'm rambling now because it's late. I'm tired. I kind of got thrown a curveball on this whole stream today, and it's kind of got me a little bit frazzled. But hopefully that makes sense. If it does not, then please, 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 please don't just leave it. Ask me about it. Message me. Give me a phone call if you know my number. Talk to me somehow, and I will discuss it with you. I'll even do a video chat if I need to talk to you face to face and work through this, because I know that it's kind of it's something, as far as I know, I'm the only person that has made this connection. I'm probably not, but I haven't bumped into anybody else that I know of who has made this connection to the grafting in and everything, the tree, the natural branches, with that covenant of circumcision, and therefore deeming that it is important and people should be doing it. As far as I know, I'm the only one that's made that connection, so I could just be totally crazy. I don't know. But I do think there is something to this, and I do think it is something worth looking into, doing some deep study on, doing some deep prayer about. And, I don't want to be misunderstood and try to make it seem that I'm focusing on the flesh. Hopefully, I've made it clear that the flesh is important, but it's always secondary to the spirit. It's always secondary to faith. So I'm going to leave you on that and head to bed here soon. I hope everybody has an awesome day. By the way, before I go, the sun has gone down here where I'm at. This week is it just so happens that the timing of this week coincides with the crucifixion week, at least as far as the way the majority of people kept the calendar for the feast days, for Yahweh's holy days, Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It works out to where Wednesday was Passover, Thursday was the first high day, the first day of unleavened bread. If we follow the account of Yahshua's crucifixion and burial, it seems that he was killed on Wednesday on Passover, buried sometime around Sunday, sunset that night. There's debate on how late in the night that was, but somewhere around that point. He was in the ground all day Thursday, all day Thursday, all day Friday, all day Saturday. Okay, because remember, he said he was going to be in the tomb 3 days and 3 nights. So there's 3 days. Okay, so Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night. Okay, so he would have risen. He would have risen right around sunset, just before sunset, I think, on the weekly Sabbath that week, which was today. Okay, so he is risen. He is risen. Praise be to Yahweh. He is risen. Okay, and so he would have at this point the stone would have been rolled away. He's out of the tomb. The women come in the morning at sunrise to visit his tomb, and he's already gone. Okay, so it just so happens that this year I am celebrating Resurrection Day, the same day that Christians are. So if you're watching this, regardless of your beliefs, regardless of any differences of opinion you might have with me, I think we can be in agreement. Praise be to the Almighty. He has risen. He is risen. And it just so happens that this also works out to where he is risen on the Feast of First Fruits. Feast of First Fruits, I'll just do a quick little thing on this. Feast of First Fruits is where you harvest the first couple sheaves of barley that gets the counting of the Omer started, which goes to Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, right? And you lift that up. You lift that up and wave it to Yahweh. And what an awesome picture that he was lifted up and raised up from the earth on the same day that this was happening with his holy days. So I'm not a proponent of Easter. I'm not an advocate of it, especially with all the pagan connections to it. But I think we stand in agreement that Resurrection Day, which is today, is the pivotal event in human history. And glory to Yahweh, glory to Yahshua that he was able to conquer death and rise from that tomb. So praise be to Yahweh for that. Good night, everyone. And I hope you have an awesome week.